Hey, Sun Devils, this is Mr. Moore, and I'm here with you guys for week 16 class notes. This is for my 12th grade government class, and our topic today, as we get close to the end of our government class, is our government at work. And we're trying to take all the pieces of the puzzle that we have put together over the last, 2 quarters and try to help us understand what is the purpose of government and where the correct line between government control of the economy and laissez-faire capitalism sit. We're going to try to tie together and get ready for the second half of our class. We're going to totally move directions and get into economics. So in Apple Valley High School, we do one semester of government, and then we do another government of economics. Now, there is a crossover between the two topics. But we do separate them to a certain extent to try to deal with both topics. So for this first semester, we've been dealing with government, and then later we're going to talk specifically about economics. But at some point, we do have to see the crossover, and we do need to take the pieces of the puzzle and fit it together. And that's ultimately what I hope to do by the time I close this class out, is helping you see those fundamental and most important documents that regulate our country. The Declaration of Independence, which separated us legally from Great Britain, written in 1776, right? We celebrated on July 4th, mostly penned by Thomas Jefferson, our third president. There were others involved as well, people like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, to name a few. And then, of course, the Constitution, where we scrapped the Articles of Confederation, which ran our country for the first 10 years or so during the Revolutionary War and directly afterwards, and really drafted ourselves a constitution which limits the power of government. And maybe that's the first thing you should highlight in your notes, is that the Constitution, which was put into full effect, it was started in 1787 and really, finalized and signed by 1788. And then we get our first president, of course, putting the Constitution into action and having our first election in 1789. We must remember that the Constitution is more important than any president. And every president who serves swears to defend the Constitution. That's literally what they are required to do when they take the oath of office and they are inaugurated as the President of the United States. And I think that's a very important thing, and that's really what we're trying to do, is take the pieces of the puzzle and put them together. I have spent time teaching you about the three branches of government, what they are called in our country, what their main job and purpose is, and how they basically function. And we're going to take all those pieces of the puzzle and put it together here at the end. We only have like one more week, and then we're going to hit finals and be done with this government class. This, of course, is not the most in-depth class. You could take an AP class where you would go a lot more in depth on each of these topics, but this is definitely a general survey class where we're covering the fundamentals of U.S. history. Now, when we talk about the three branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial, we also have to pause for a minute and remember the key word federalism, because there is three branches of government at the federal level in Washington, D.C., right? The legislative at the federal level is called Congress. And the executive branch at the federal level is called the president and his cabinet. And the judicial branch at the federal level is the Supreme Court. But we also have these three branches in each of our individual states. And that's what creates us a federal system, a federalism, where we've separated the power not just between three branches, but also between a national or federal level and a local or state level. And a lot of countries do this, as we have discussed in past lectures. But in the state of California, we have our own legislative branch that makes laws specifically for California, the state assembly. Okay? We also have at the state level an executive branch, the governor, okay, who enforces the laws. Remember, it is just the legislative branch that makes laws. The executive branch has no business constitutionally making laws. And we see sometimes executive branches at the federal level, like the president, who makes an executive order, or a governor who enacts an executive order, sometimes overstepping their bounds constitutionally. And these are the kind of times where we should get involved and recognize how our government should work, how it does work, and how it should work. And those are two different things. We also have our own court system in each state, depending on which law is broken and where jurisdiction lies. Okay. And of course, we have a Supreme Court of California. Okay. So there's three branches at the federal level and the three branches at the state level. And this creates an even more separation of power. It can get frustrating because it's complicated, but it was designed this way on purpose so that no one person or no one group of people could seize power away from citizens. We are not subjects of a king. The Declaration of Independence separated us from Great Britain, where we are no longer subject to a king, but we are now citizens of the Republic. And the United States is clearly a republic. Please remember what you say when you do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, sometimes we say that so often in schools or at ceremonies or sporting events, and sometimes we forget what we are reminding ourselves of a government lesson, where power lies and where it shouldn't lie. We've got to protect our rights or they could disappear. As I've joked around sometime, if you don't know your rights, then you won't have any rights, right? I mean, don't worry if you don't know your rights. They'll, if you ignore them, they'll disappear, right? And I'm joking, of course, and being sarcastic because none of us should do that, right? We can't ignore our rights or they'll go away. So remember, there are some systems where there's a national government that controls everything, a unitary system, okay, where it dominates and is powerful. Then there's a federal system where the people are the ones who are choosing the national government and choosing their state government. And thus those two entities are sharing power, okay, instead of coming from a central authority. Now we have to be careful because if we think that the president of the United States has the power to enact law across the entire United States, then we don't understand our government. And then we are allowing our government to take more control than it should. That's the whole purpose of a constitution, is to limit the powers of government. This goes right back to the very first lessons we had in this class. There are confederation systems. The United States started as a confederacy. And I don't mean the Confederacy. Remember, we started off with the Articles of Confederation for the first 10 years. Now, 70, 80, 90 years later, okay, in the middle of the 1800s, we actually get a group of states break away and I guess you could say reform a confederacy, and we get the Civil War. But the entire United States started off as a confederacy, a loose joining of states under the Articles of Confederation, where there wasn't a central government or a federal government. And so our country has gone through some changes, and there are different systems that exist out in there in the world. But how is public policy made at various levels of government? If I'm going to build a shed on my property, I have to go to the town council and look at the town ordinances of Apple Valley and make sure that those town ordinances, that the town of Apple Valley has to make sure that they don't fall outside of California laws and regulations, because California itself has a constitution. Okay? And then, of course, California has to make sure it falls under the general auspices of the Constitution of the United States. And so we have various levels of government. We call that, in general, federalism in our system, in order to show how we divide those powers up. So again, in the state of California, we do have a state assembly, okay? And there's actually two houses in our state legislature. If you go up to Sacramento, the capital of California, You can actually walk through the state capitol building. I've done it lots of times. I lived in the Sacramento area for quite a while. And then obviously we have the executive branch, the governor and lieutenant governor and things like that, and an appellate court system and the state Supreme Court. And then we have local entities, districts and counties and cities. And again, that's how do we regulate departments, agencies, function, and how do state and local regulatory agencies differ from those at the federal level? And when it comes to voting, like everybody's focused on the presidential election that just happened in 2020. But what about Congress? All the seats in the House were up, and a third of the Senate seats in the federal government. But there was also, people were voting in different states on state legislatures, gubernatorial races, and even sometimes mayors of cities and city councils. So there's a lot more at stake. In California, we also have propositions and measures that we were voting on where we actually get to do a little bit of direct democracy because remember, our system is a republic. So there's very often we choose people to represent us and they make the laws, the legislature. But there are some times where we get involved with direct democracy and actually get to vote on measures and propositions. And you'll hear those come up on ballots. Okay. Now, the three branches, this is an example of how they might interact with each other. One example is something called impeachment, where the president of the United States cannot do whatever they want. If they break the law, they can be held accountable just like anyone else. Now, earlier we talked about the power of the president to pardon those who break the law, but that it's pretty clear that a president cannot pardon themselves. They can't go around breaking the law and forgiving themselves because they have to be held accountable. So an impeachment is a charge of misconduct made against the holder of a public office. We usually think about this against the president, but this shows us that whole checks and balance system. Okay, according to the U.S. Constitution, impeachment must start in the House of Representatives if we're talking about the impeachment of a president. Okay, it starts in the House of Representatives, and the Senate is the one that actually conducts the trial. So if the president is impeached, the trial will happen in the Senate, presided over by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, there's only been 3 presidents who have been impeached. The first one to be impeached was Andrew Johnson, who was the vice president of Abraham Lincoln. Remember, just a few days after the Civil War is done, Lincoln is shot and killed in Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. And so the vice president became the president, and it was right after the Civil War. So there's a lot of tension. I mean, literal 600,000 people dead and a lot more killed, maimed, and, the amount of money spent, and, the whole country was just in shambles. And so he was impeached and not the most popular president ever. But then we went for quite a while until Bill Clinton, who swore under oath that he was not scootily pooping around with one of his interns. He didn't get in trouble for, having sexual relations with an intern. What he got in trouble for was lying under oath, saying that he wasn't, messing around and fooling around. And so he was impeached. But again, neither one of those 2 presidents were removed from office. The third time was under, right now when I'm recording this, at the end of 2020, our current president is Donald Trump. And he was also impeached for some things that he was using the privileges and powers of his office against a political opponent. But he was impeached, but again, not removed. So far, nobody has been removed from office. There was a president, it was very clear, would have been removed, but he decided to resign before he was impeached, and that's Richard Nixon. And he came on TV one day and said, hey, effective at noon, I'm not going to be president anymore. And so his vice president stepped in, Gerald Ford, and so he probably would have been removed from office, but he chose to resign instead, but he wasn't officially impeached. But this shows us that no person is above the law, and the Constitution is more important than a person. And that transfer of power is so significant. Now, how are laws made? I think it should be pointed out that the executive branch has no business making laws. The executive branch job is to enforce laws. It's the legislative branch that makes laws. A bill is a law that is in the process of being made. Okay, so how does a bill become law? Well, a bill can start in either house of Congress. If you look at my chart here, an idea could be introduced in the House or the Senate. And then small committees, that small groups of people, could meet together in the Senate or in the House and work on this bill, and what they like about it, what they don't. People can throw ideas in. It can go to subcommittees for studies, and they can have hearings and change things and mark it up. But then it's presented on the House floor or the Senate floor. And if they get a majority in the House, then they hand it over to the Senate. And the same thing, if the Senate passes a bill, then they hand it over to the House. Okay? And if it's approved in both houses without changes, then it would be presented to the president for review. The president can sign it, approve it, and it becomes a law. Or the president could say, nah, and he can veto it, and it goes back to the House it originated in. If it does that, if it goes through the same process again without being changed, then the president has to sign it. If they change things, the president says, hey, I'm not going to sign it until you change this. Remember, it's his job to enforce the laws. So the House and the Senate, if they really want a law, can override the president. One of the problems I see in modern politics is presidents who want to get things done and are being stopped by Congress, maybe because of political problems, political issues, and not working across the aisle, as they say. I have air quotes going on. I think it's important that presidents do not initiate these executive orders. That's a precedence that modern presidents have been using more and more. And I think it's dangerous because it slaps in the face the process designed by the Constitution to limit the powers of government and to keep a checks and balance system in place. Now, how does Congress work on a day-to-day basis? Most of the work in Congress is done in committees. Because the Senate is 100 people in 2020, there are 50 states, 2 senators from each state. That means 100 senators. That's a lot of people. And if you've ever been in a group of 100 trying to get something done, it can be very difficult. So breaking it up, the tasks into smaller, bite-sized chunks, and having smaller groups meet is a more effective way to get things done. The House of Representatives is 435, right? So we're talking way more people. The number of representatives that each state gets to the House of Representatives is based on the population of the state. And keeping that in mind, it's really important to understand that you usually can't have 435 people get anything done. So you got to break it up into smaller bite-sized chunks. So some congressional committees are permanent, or they're called standing committees, where they always exist. Okay. And some are temporary. They're special and they're just, for a specific problem that's happening. Some are joint, where you get members from both houses, like some members from the Senate and from the House that sit on a committee together because Congress has to work together. Okay. But those, and we're not going to get more specific in a general education class, but you have to understand that congressional committees and who holds positions in a congressional committee can give you power in Congress. Being the head of a permanent standing committee can give a member of Congress significant power. Okay, and which committee you get on. If you're on a committee where you're in control of the finances or on military budget, that's huge. If you end up on a committee for something that the general population doesn't care about, then your power is greatly reduced in Congress. So the power of Congress is to make the laws. But Congress also controls the purse, right? This power over the money is what really makes Congress important. okay? Because they control the power of the purse. How do we use our tax dollars, and what kinds of issues does each level of government handle? And remember, as we're talking about how our government works and the powers delegated to the national government versus the powers reserved to each of the individual states. And there are some overlap, right? Some places where those powers are overshared. Now, if you look at the budget of the United States, you can see what we care most about. Okay, this is a 2017 chart, so a few years old, but definitely within the term of our last president. And you can see close to 30% of our nation's budget is spent on healthcare. And this is a couple years before COVID-19. So you know that this is going to be way different in 2020, right? How much money? Military, obviously important. Okay, we're spending a huge chunk of our money on interest because we have national debt. We're paying our veterans, we're trying to support the unemployed, and obviously these numbers are going to change a lot in 2020. And we're always trying to look for recent data. But the truth is, I'm recording this before 2020 is over, so we don't know exactly how much we spent. It's going to be at least, a year after 2020 is done before we get some really hard statistical data to be able to dice apart. Food and agriculture, actual money spent on government, housing, energy, international affairs, science, transportation. So you can see what we care about by where we spend our money. And how do we get our money? This is kind of the crossover between government and economics. And it comes down to the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. In the United States, we collect different kinds of taxes. There's property taxes. There's let's get into it. There's three basic types of taxes, or three ways the government taxes its citizens: property tax, income tax, and sales tax. Hopefully they're kind of explanatory. Property tax is if you own a piece of land or a building or a house, okay, some actual physical piece of property, then you would pay a tax based on its value. Okay, income tax is the amount of money you earn at a job, and the government takes its slice of the pie. And when I say the government, there's actually two governments: the state government and the federal government, right? We talked about this before. Your gross income, how much you actually make, and then your net income is what you actually get to keep and take home after you pay taxes and Social Security and blah, blah, blah. Okay, and I say blah, blah, blah because there's lots of different things. Sales tax is something interesting when you go to buy a product and you actually pay more than what you think you should because, say, it costs $999 and you end up spending $1,200 and you're like, what's the extra $200? Taxes, right? Just wait until you buy your first car and you see a car for $20,000 and you end up walking out paying $28,000. You're like, what? $8,000 extra? Huh. Trust me, there's all kinds of extras that are slapped on and it can be very frustrating. Okay. And again, as I said, there are two levels of government. The federal government's taking its chunk and the state government's taking its chunk. Okay, there are three types of taxes. There are proportional taxes, progressive taxes, and regressive taxes. So let's break this down here, okay? Proportional tax impose the same percentage of taxation on everyone regardless of income. So if we had a proportional tax, like say 10%, easy to figure out taxes. You have $100, you pay 10. You have $1, you give a dime. You have $1,000, you give 100. So it's proportional. It's the same percentage. There's progressive tax, which imposes a higher percentage of taxation on those with higher income. So there's different brackets. And so what's a proportional tax? That's like sales tax. Like everybody pays the same. Doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, there's a certain percentage on the sales tax, okay? Progressive tax, we apply that to, like, say, income tax, where you might fit in a different bracket. If I make under $100,000 a year, or if I make over $100,000 a year, then I might be in a different tax bracket, and it changes per year, and that's why taxes can be kind of complicated, and people spend money to have other people do their taxes because there are laws, rules, and regulations that have to be implemented. A regressive tax imposes a higher tax rate of taxation on lower income. And you're like, what? Who would do that? Well, I mean, there are some people would say regressive taxes. Sometimes people say on like alcohol or tobacco sales, where we charge this really high amount that sometimes just lower income people do. I mean, that's kind of a tricky thing to look at, but sometimes we have a high tax on something that low income people get into. And so thus they're getting hit harder with taxes, and they say, oh, that's not fair. And so there are some regressive taxes, but proportional taxes, think sales taxes. Progressive, think income, okay? And regressive, there's not a whole bunch of that around, but that's kind of a case-by-case scenario. So if you have questions about that, I would be happy to talk about it in class. Okay? There's two different words, debt versus deficit. The national debt is the amount of money the U.S. government owes. The U.S. government borrows money. Okay, so people, regular people, might buy, say, bonds. That is, they give their money to the U.S. government, promising to get that money back in return with interest. So the U.S. government is borrowing tons of money. The amount of money the U.S. government spends more than it takes in, that's what we call the deficit. Okay, so if you take in $1 trillion, but you spend $2 trillion, then now you are $1 trillion in debt. So the deficit is $1 trillion, but the debt might be 6 trillion because you've done this over the last 6 years. So there are two different words. The debt, the amount of money the U.S. government owes, and the deficit is the amount of money the U.S. government spends more than it takes in each year. Two different things. Okay? So if we're talking about the federal and the state level and who's in charge of what, sometimes, and of course the local, and we've even talked about that. Let's say you live here in Apple Valley. Okay, you live within the boundaries of California, so there are certain California laws, but California is clearly within the United States. Okay, but you also live in the town of Apple Valley, and so sometimes there are crossovers. Okay, and what happens when there is overlapping jurisdiction? You know, the Constitution, the 6th article of the Constitution tells us the national law is supreme, national supremacy. But also, the Bill of Rights says that if the Constitution doesn't give the federal government the direct, power to do something, then the state has the power to do that. And so there is debates and lawsuits even between the federal government and the state governments. We even saw that in the 2020 election when the federal government started suing different states on electoral votes and such like that, okay? And how does a local, your natural gas and your water, right, and your local, community schools and such, okay? These are shared powers. And this is a great chart to look at to see which entity of government has the authority. And I think that's really significant. How things work, well, money talks, doesn't it? The government's taking in money and it's distributing it. Now, some people think that it's distributing it fairly. Some think that it's not. Some people say the government shouldn't be distributing money because it's my money. It's not the government's money. The government is not there to control my life. The government is to be a servant of the people. And remember, the Constitution limits the power of government. So, what is the proper role of government? As we get close to finishing off this school year, I have some food for thought. And I'd like you to digest this information and see if you agree with it, if you have comments or concerns or thoughts. But these are, in general, American values and the proper role of government. Governments are instituted for the benefit of mankind. Men and women should be accountable for their acts in relation to them, both in making laws and administering them for the good and safety of society. So people should be accountable. And we've got to make sure that our government's accountable to the people, but also the people are accountable to the government. Because if we don't have law and order in society, then death and anarchy and corruption There's some serious problems. Number 2 here, no government can exist in peace except such laws are framed and are upheld to secure to each individual the free exercise of conscience and the right and control of property and protection of life. That's the role of government. Go look at the Declaration of Independence. Okay, because it states that, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are the fundamental documents that govern our ideas about, how our government should work. The last thought is that all men and women are bound to sustain and uphold the respective governments in which they reside if the government protects their inherent and inalienable rights by the laws of such governments. So you should be a law-abiding citizen as long as the government is protecting your rights. That's what it means in plain English. Sedition and rebellion are unbecoming, every citizen thus protected, and should be punished accordingly. And that all governments have a right to enact such laws as their own judgments are best calculated to secure the public interest, at the same time, however, holding sacred the freedom of conscience. Remember, everybody loves that freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the right to assemble peaceably and petition their government for redresses, and the right to bear arms, and their right to private property not to be secured by the government, and their right to be protected from search, unreasonable search and seizure, and the rights of the accused, the right to remain silent and to have due process of law, the rights to an attorney or legal counsel, even if you can't afford one, both in a criminal suit and in a in a common lawsuit, or what they call civil court. The rights the government can't have unreasonable bail or punishment, the rights of the people and of the states and of the citizens. I've just kind of reviewed the Bill of Rights right there. We had another lesson on it. Guys, thank you so much. If you have questions, please bring them to class. I always have some great review videos, okay, where I try to pull in some stuff from YouTube, crash course videos on government and some other, ideas that get us thinking about government and how it should work. And I want to close this off, week 16, on our government at work. Thanks for being with me. And next week will be our last week. Week 17 is our last week on our government notes, where we talk about governments around the world and we do some comparison and also trying to tie it into what's happening in the modern world. Thanks for being with me.